under a low gray sky. The hills of western Germany were silent except for the distant thunder of tank engines. It was late March 1945. The war was nearly over, but no one in the small village of Dernau believed that peace was close. The sound of American armor echoed through the Eifel valleys, growing louder with every passing hour. Farmers hid their livestock, children were kept indoors, and smoke rose from the last bonfires where documents and uniforms were being burned. Along the edge of the Ahr River, a German mother named Marta Weiss looked out from the window of her farmhouse. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of decision. By that spring, the German front had shattered. The First U.S. Army had broken through at Remagen, pushing deep into the heart of the Rhineland. Town after town fell as the Americans swept east, supported by endless convoys of Sherman tanks and artillery. For the villagers of Dernau, the rumble of treads was the sound of doom. Rumors ran wild, of tanks crushing homes, of artillery wiping out villages mistaken for strongpoints, of surrendering soldiers shot in confusion. The local Wehrmacht detachment had fled 2 nights earlier, leaving behind a few broken rifles and a handful of desperate young men. Dernau was defenseless. Marta Weiss was 42 years old, a mother of 3, and the widow of a carpenter killed near Kursk in 1943. She had seen the Reich rise and crumble. Her village, nestled in the folds of the Ahr Valley, was surrounded by forest and vineyards. From her kitchen window, she could see the main road snaking down from the hills, a route the Americans would almost certainly take. The villagers debated what to do. Some wanted to flee, others wanted to dig in. But Marta had a different idea, one born of desperation and cunning. That night, while the men argued, she gathered a few of the older children and the village teacher. They took lanterns and white sheets and moved through the narrow lanes, marking windows and rooftops with crude symbols that looked like surrender signs. She told them to gather anything that reflected light, mirrors, tin plates, even shards of glass, and place them along the hillside. To the Americans approaching from the west, the reflections would look like water. The next morning, when the first U.S. scouts peered through their binoculars, the little village below shimmered like a flooded valley. The trick worked for a day. The Americans stopped short, unsure if the road was passable. Engineers moved forward, then halted again as artillery spotters reported the glint of possible mines or booby traps. Marta watched them from the shadows of her barn, her children clutching her dress. She didn't know how long it would last. She only knew she had bought them time. That afternoon, she organized the villagers into silence. No fires, no smoke, no movement in daylight. Horses were hidden in cellars, and chickens were slaughtered to stop their noise. The villagers dug trenches, not to fight, but to bury the debris that might give away their presence. They smeared soot over white walls so they would blend with the earth. From a distance, Dernau looked abandoned. The Americans bypassed it, turning their tanks toward a larger road north of the river. For 3 days, they did not return, but the ruse could not hold forever. The sound of engines returned on the 5th morning. Columns of Shermans and half-tracks rolled through the nearby valley, probing the terrain. An artillery observer spotted the church steeple, the only structure Marta had failed to conceal, and marked it on his map. That night, the first shells landed on the outskirts of the village. Windows shattered, and the old stone chapel cracked under the impact. Marta led a group of villagers to the churchyard under cover of darkness. They hauled down the iron cross from the steeple and toppled it into the grass, disguising the church as a ruined shell. The next day, reconnaissance planes circled overhead. From above, Dernau looked deserted, burned out, lifeless. The pilots saw no sign of German troops, no movement, and no smoke. The American column moved on again, convinced the place had already been leveled. For a week, the villagers lived like ghosts, surviving on canned food and melted snow. Marta kept the children quiet with stories. She told them their father was watching from the stars, that silence was their shield. By the second week, tension frayed. A few young men wanted to surrender openly. They feared being mistaken for resistance fighters. But Marta reminded them that the front was collapsing and that within days, the Americans would move past the valley entirely. She had overheard on a scavenged radio that Cologne had already fallen. Every day they stayed hidden, their chances of survival grew. On April 1st, an American patrol entered the valley again. This time, the tanks stopped at the edge of the woods. Infantry fanned out, checking for mines. A few soldiers walked toward the village square, weapons low, uncertain. Marta stepped out alone, wearing a white scarf. She carried no flag, no sign, just her presence. The soldiers raised their rifles, then lowered them. One of them, a young lieutenant from Ohio, realized the village was full of civilians. He ordered his men to hold fire. The tanks remained at the edge of the road, their engines idling like beasts held on a leash. When the Americans finally entered Dernau, they found no soldiers, no defenses, only a frightened, silent people and a woman standing in front of them, her children behind her. The lieutenant asked through an interpreter why they had stayed. Marta's answer was simple: because there is nothing left to fight for. The young officer nodded, looked around at the empty houses, and told his men to move on. The tanks rumbled away without firing a shot. In the aftermath, Dernau was one of the few villages in the region left standing. Dozens of nearby towns had been shelled or burned in the chaos of the final push to the Rhine. Marta never saw herself as a hero. She returned to her kitchen, tending to her children, while the Americans moved deeper into Germany. But among the villagers, her act became legend, a story of quiet defiance, of courage without a rifle. For weeks, she had hidden an entire community in plain sight. Using only light, silence, and fear, the war would end within a month. But for Marta Weiss and the people of Dernau, survival had already been victory. They had faced the steel storm and endured. Yet, even as peace returned, the question lingered in the valley. How could one woman, without weapons or orders, outwit an army that spanned continents? The answer lay not in strength, but in something deeper, and that truth would emerge in the next chapter of her story. The truth behind Marta Weiss's act was not mere luck or coincidence. Hidden beneath her calm defiance was a plan rooted in knowledge few civilians possessed. Before the war, Marta's husband, Wilhelm, had worked as a carpenter at an airfield near Bonn. From him, she had learned how light, angles, and camouflage could fool the human eye. When Allied bombers came for the airfield, the workers used decoys, fake runways built with mirrors and tar. Wilhelm had told her once, "War isn't just about guns, Marta. It's about who can see whom first." Those words echoed in her mind when she stood on the hillside that night, lantern in hand, trying to make her village disappear. Her instinct had mirrored one of the greatest hidden strengths of the German defense, its mastery of concealment and deception. By 1945, German engineers and camouflage units, known as Tarnung detachments, had perfected the art of illusion. They could disguise artillery under netting so real it fooled reconnaissance planes, or turn entire factories invisible from the sky with paint and shadow. Marta's village trick was small-scale mimicry of a strategy once used to hide armored divisions. What she did with sheets and soot, the Wehrmacht had done with entire armies. While the front crumbled and the Reich gasped its last, American commanders had grown wary of traps. Every farmhouse, every tree line, every patch of mist could conceal danger. The terrain of the Ahr Valley was treacherous: steep ridges, narrow bridges, and thick woods. Tank crews called it Panther Country. The U.S. 3rd Armored Division had already lost several Shermans to hidden anti-tank guns further south. So when aerial photos showed glints of light near Dernau, analysts assumed it was water, maybe even mines beneath the surface. Marta's crude deception, guided by instinct and faint memories of her husband's stories, tapped straight into that fear. But her success depended on timing as much as illusion. American armor relied on speed and coordination. Each advance depended on clear reconnaissance and air cover. By halting one column for even a day, she created a bottleneck. Engineers had to confirm the road was safe before heavy armor could pass. This forced a reroute northward, an operational pause that, while insignificant to generals, meant survival for her village. Small disruptions like these multiplied across the front as the Allies pushed into the heart of Germany. Every lost hour bought time for civilians to flee or hide. What Marta could not have known was that her village lay directly along a secondary route meant for fuel convoys. The Americans were moving fast, and their supply lines were stretched thin. Each Sherman tank consumed almost 2 gallons of fuel per mile. A single armored division could burn through 100,000 gallons a day. By forcing even a brief detour, She had unwittingly altered a logistical artery of the advance. Fuel trucks idled for hours at a crossroads outside Dernau, while engineers scouted the valley. Somewhere behind the front, an officer scribbled, "Route impassable, possible flooding." It was irony in its purest form. A German mother, armed only with household scraps, had outmaneuvered the most mechanized army on Earth. Yet her act wasn't just defiance. It was survival through understanding. She had sensed the Americans' caution, their adherence to procedure, and their respect for reconnaissance data. They had been trained to trust what they saw more than what they heard. And she had simply changed what they saw. For nearly 2 weeks, Dernau remained invisible. But illusion can only last so long before curiosity breaks it. When the second patrol approached, Marta knew deception alone would no longer hold. She shifted from hiding in the village to controlling the encounter. By then, the people had grown gaunt, their nerves frayed. Food had run low, and the children's silence had turned from obedience to exhaustion. She realized the next phase of her plan had to be psychological. When she stepped out to meet the American lieutenant, she did so with deliberate calm. Witnesses later recalled that she did not raise her hands and surrender, but simply stood there, as if receiving guests. The lieutenant hesitated. This was not the reaction of a hostile. He could sense fear in her eyes, but also dignity. That hesitation was everything. In those few seconds, he saw not an enemy, but a mother. The human moment disarmed him faster than any white flag. After the war, American records noted that Dernau had been cleared without incident. To the military, it was a trivial entry in a daily log. But within that entry lay an unseen duel between instinct and machinery, perception and power. Marta Weiss had demonstrated that deception could be born not from strategy, but from empathy, from understanding how an enemy thinks. She had used not weapons, but psychology. Technically, what she achieved aligned with what modern militaries would later term passive defense, using terrain, light, and silence to break the enemy's targeting process. Similar principles would shape Cold War doctrines of concealment and electronic countermeasures. What Marta improvised in her valley, the manipulation of visual signals, was a precursor to the radar jamming and stealth technologies that came decades later. In that sense, her act stood as a rare moment where civilian instinct met military science. Historians later pieced together fragments of her story from testimonies and local records. They learned she coordinated the placement of mirrors along the ridgeline based on the angle of afternoon sunlight, ensuring that reflected light would fall directly into the American observation line at around 3 p.m., the time scouts typically surveyed terrain. It was deliberate, not accidental. She had even used blackened vinegar to dull glass that reflected too brightly, preventing suspicion. These were not random actions. They were calculated deceptions at a village scale, but the most striking revelation came from the American side. One tank crewman, interviewed decades later, recalled that the valley looked eerily dead, like it had drowned. He described how his platoon leader had ordered them to halt, fearing an ambush. "We'd seen villages blown to pieces," he said, "but that one looked like the earth had swallowed it." Marta's illusion had tapped into the soldiers' collective memory of destroyed towns, turning absence itself into camouflage to be why the time the war ended. The First Army had recorded hundreds of minor engagements across the Rhineland. Dernau never appeared among them. It was as if the village had vanished from history, surviving by erasing its own existence. Only years later, when locals spoke freely, did the full story emerge, of a mother who used reflection and silence to defeat an invasion without firing a shot. And yet, beneath the ingenuity lay a deeper truth. Marta's deception was born not from loyalty to a collapsing Reich, but from love of her people. In her mind, saving the village meant saving what little remained of her children's world. She had chosen cunning over obedience, humanity over ideology. That quiet rebellion made her both an outlier and a symbol. Still, the question lingered. What happened when the tanks finally rolled past? What became of the woman who had fooled an army? And how did her act echo through the ruins of post-war Germany? The answer, as history would reveal, was both heartbreaking and profound, because Marta Weiss's victory carried a price she could never escape. When the Americans left Dernau behind, silence returned, but it was a silence unlike before. The villagers emerged from cellars and barns as if waking from a long, dark dream. The war was still raging beyond the hills, But in that narrow valley, it felt as if time had stopped. Marta Weiss walked the empty road where the tanks had stood. The ground was scarred by tracks, yet her home still stood, the fields were still green, and her children were still alive. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. Not for the dead or the fallen Reich, but for the sheer miracle that her village still breathed. In the weeks that followed, the Americans returned, this time as occupiers, not enemies. Their trucks brought supplies, doctors, and food. To them, Dernau was a curiosity, a German village untouched by war in a region of ashes. When the local U.S. civil affairs officers interviewed villagers to understand how it had survived, every path led back to one name. The widow Weiss, they said. The soldiers found her in her garden, tending to the soil. When asked what she had done, she shrugged. "I just kept us quiet," she said. The officer wrote in his notes, "The civilian avoided engagement through concealment." Remarkable composure. But behind Marta's calm face, there was a deeper conflict. Some villagers began to whisper that she had cooperated with the Americans, that she had signaled them on purpose. In a shattered nation where blame replaced loyalty, survival itself could look like betrayal. Marta endured the gossip with the same quiet she had used to hide her people. Yet inside, the guilt grew heavy. She had saved the village, but not everyone. The old pastor had died during the shelling of the church. 2 boys who went searching for food had never returned. Survival had its ghosts, and they visited her every night. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, Dernau became part of the American occupation zone. The valley filled with convoys and engineers rebuilding bridges. The Ahr River, once a line of fear, became a path of supplies. For the Americans stationed there, the war's violence faded quickly into routine. But for Marta, it lingered in every sound: the clank of metal, the echo of boots, the hum of engines. Even in peace, she could not forget the moment when a single decision had turned her home invisible. In the years after, historians began piecing together stories from across Germany, tales of villages spared by accident or courage. Yet none carried the strange blend of strategy and instinct found in Dernau. Military analysts later noted that the deception tactics Marta used were eerily similar to Allied ghost army methods, the use of light, reflection, and illusion to mislead enemies. In 1944, American engineers from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had projected fake tanks and sound effects to confuse German intelligence. Marta, without training or equipment, had done something comparable, an accidental echo of the enemy's own innovation. The legacy of such acts reshaped how both sides viewed the battlefield. The war had taught commanders that perception could be more powerful than firepower. What began as camouflage nets and decoy trucks evolved into Cold War doctrines of radar masking, electronic countermeasures, and psychological warfare. In that evolution, the idea born in a quiet German valley found its reflection: the belief that what cannot be seen cannot be destroyed. Engineers who once studied the ruins of Europe would later design aircraft meant to vanish from radar, submarines that dissolved into the sea's noise, and weapons that misled the very sensors meant to find them. Marta's village had lived that principle before it had a name, yet her personal life did not follow such triumph. By 1950, post-war recovery had turned villages like Dernau into agricultural suppliers for the occupying forces. American trucks still passed through, but now they carried aid, not troops. Marta's children grew up amid ruins being rebuilt into vineyards. Her eldest son, Karl, would later say that his mother never spoke of the war except once. "She told me," he recalled, "that sometimes silence is louder than any explosion." That single sentence became her epitaph. In archives decades later, a U.S. officer's report would resurface describing Dernau's survival as an anomaly, unexplained. Historians re-examined aerial reconnaissance photos from March 1945. The images showed clear reflections near the valley slopes and no signs of life, just as Marta had planned. Analysts concluded that the mirrored hillside had tricked the pilots into believing the area was flooded. One even remarked that civilian terrain deception had occurred independently of any military order. It was the only known case of its kind in the Rhineland campaign. Psychologists studying post-war Germany would later use cases like Marta's to understand how trauma forged resilience. The people of Dernau had lived under constant fear, yet they adapted faster than units with command structures. Without orders, they developed systems of cooperation, silence, and trust, traits that mirrored guerrilla or survival networks. In the absence of authority, it was empathy that kept them alive. Marta had not led through rank or fear, but through understanding that as the decades passed, Marta faded into anonymity. The new West Germany turned its eyes toward prosperity, factories, and modern highways. Few remembered the little valley that had once fooled the world's most advanced army. But every spring, when the AHR vineyards bloomed again, locals would tell the story in whispers, the tale of the widow who made her village disappear. To them, it wasn't just a story of survival. It was a parable about the strange power of ordinary people in extraordinary times that in the end, the lesson of Dernau was not about tactics or technology. It was about the human mind under pressure, the way instinct can become strategy and fear can turn into invention. In the chaos of 1945, when nations collapsed and armies lost their way, one woman's courage preserved a corner of humanity amid madness. She had outwitted steel and command, not with force, but with understanding. Years later, when her grandson visited the United States, he found the descendant of that American lieutenant who had once faced her in the valley. They met over coffee, 2 generations removed from war. The lieutenant's grandson listened as the German man told the story of how his grandmother had saved a village. When he finished, there was silence between them. Then the American said softly, "My grandfather always wondered why that valley felt so peaceful." The world had changed beyond recognition, but the echo of that moment endured, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary victories are invisible. In war and peace alike, power often belongs not to those who strike the hardest, but to those who see the clearest. Marta Weiss had seen, in a flash of light and instinct, that survival depended not on defeating the enemy, but on convincing them there was nothing left to fight. And in that fragile illusion, she saved everything that truly mattered.